Hello everyone, and welcome back to the History of Africa podcast. I'm your host, Andy. Last episode, we examined the context of East African trade in the early medieval era, and the geography that would one day lend itself to Kilwa, becoming the preeminent trading city in the region. But for now, we left the city as a wound-up ball of potential, still just a mere small town, one with a great future, but no idea of what lay ahead of it. But around the same time that Kilwa begins to show its first signs of growth, we also enter an era of immense historiographical controversy. Today we examine the potentially mythical, or maybe all too real origins of the Kilwa Sultanate, as we explore the controversial document, or should I say documents, known collectively as the Kilwa Chronicle. Season 5, Episode 6. The Kilwa Chronicle, Make Way for Prince Ali. In a continent like Africa, where the legacy of 19th century colonialism still looms quite large, questions about the interactions between Africans and non-Africans are potentially thorny topics. Modern academic history as we know it emerged during the late 19th and early 20th centuries, a time when colonial rule in Africa was not some distant memory, but a still ongoing process. It's no secret that early European histories of the continent, influenced by the racialist ideology of colonialism, often tried to use questions of interaction between Africans and non-Africans to justify the continent's purported lack of advanced civilization, which itself was used to justify the continent's subjugation as bringing civilization. The most infamous example of this type of historiography lies just to the south and west of the Swahili coast, with the large stone cities of the Limpopo and Zambezi valleys. Cities like Kami, Great Zimbabwe, Zvongombe, and Mapungubwe, due to their large-scale, intricate urban planning and unique architecture, seemingly argued against the notion of Africa as a primitive place without advanced social or governmental structures. To reconcile this incongruity with their ideology, European archaeologists were often ordered by colonial governments to represent these structures as being built by non-Africans. They were often described as, say, the ancient Phoenician trading posts from the fabled circumnavigation of Africa, or settlements built by medieval Arabs to trade along the valley. Of course, even at that time, many archaeologists and anthropologists recognized that this was a misrepresentation of reality. And these days, they are universally recognized for what they were: urban settlements built by the local people to the region. The cities of the Zambezi and Limpopo valleys are just one of many examples of people using claims of outside origins to discredit the achievement of African civilizations. As a result, for those of us studying African history, we can have a bit of a primal, visceral reaction when we see these types of claims. It's tempting to just dismiss any claim of influence from outside Africa as just another plain and tired extension of this colonial trope. However, we do also have to be careful. The reality is that the history of the world, no matter where you go, was one of cultural mixing, diffusion, and international influence. Humans ourselves originated as a nomadic species, moving from place to place. And even as we settled down, we continued to trade and intermarry with each other. It happened in Europe, Asia, it happened in America, and of course it has happened in Africa as well. I bring up this long tangent for a reason, and that is that the official historical record of the Kilwa Sultanate frames it not only as a place where cultural mixing happened, but that the kingdom was itself founded as an expression of cultural mixing between East Africa and the Middle East. Indeed, the official historical record from the Kilwa Sultanate itself claims that the island's prominence comes from a series of foreign settlers. However, the idea itself of an official history is somewhat mired in controversy as well. The historical record of Kilwa lies primarily on a combination of two similar documents, one from the 16th and one from either the late 18th or early 19th century, a long time after the events that they describe take place. These documents recount the same general story, and each of them claim not to be original at all, but rather deriving from an older, locally written Swahili document. The first of them comes from a Portuguese book detailing the history of exploration and colonization in the Indian Ocean. Which details the then recent history of Portugal's exploration and colonization in the Indian Ocean. By proxy, some of the histories of the states they interacted with are included as well. In the 8th volume of the Décadas de Asia, as it's called, the author shares a story relating to the foundation of Kilwa, supposedly based on an older document from the city itself. From a couple centuries later, we have an Arabic manuscript written by an Omani Arab author, known as the Kitab al-Sulwa fi Akhbar Kilwa, which similarly presents an account of the city's origins, as well as its founding. One of the defining shared elements of these documents, known collectively as the Kilwa Chronicle, is the purported foreign origins of the city's first rulers. In particular, they claim that the city of Kilwa was founded by a prince from the Middle East. However, he was not an Arab, but rather an Iranian. For the next section, let's read directly from the Portuguese version of the Chronicle.
According to what we learned from a chronicle of the kings of this city, it was in the 400th year of Muhammad, and 80 years after the construction of the oldest Somali cities in Magadha, that a Moorish king named Sultan Hassan reigned in the Persian city of Shiraz. By the time the king died, he had several sons. One of them, called Ali, was little esteemed among his brothers because his mother was in a long enslaved caste of the Abeshes Ethiopians, while his brothers were from the noblest lineage of the princes of Persia. But through his lineage, Ali had gained both wisdom and prudence. He decided to avoid the contempt and the plotting of his brothers, and he undertook to seek a new settlement, which would give him a better fortune than he had among his own. Because he was already married, he took his wife, children, family, and some people who helped him in his enterprise. He embarked on 2 ships on the island of Hormuz, and due to its golden reputation, came to the coast of Zanzibar. He arrived at the villages of Magadajao and Brava. He intended to found his own village where he would be lord and not anyone's slave, and ran to the coast further ahead that came to that port of Kilwa. And seeing the layout, he came to the place of the surrounded by water, where he could live safe from the insults of the heathens, those who lived on Kilwa, in exchange for precious cloths and a trusted relationship, went to the mainland. After the last ones had left, he began to fortify the island, not only against the heathens, but against some neighboring Moorish villages which they called Songo and Janga, which were under the lordship of Mompana, 20 leagues away from Kilwa. However, as he was a prudent man, and of a great spirit, Ali soon became so strong that Kilwa became a noble town, receiving its current name and beginning to lord over its neighbors itself.
Okay, so there's a lot more to the Portuguese Kilwa Chronicle than that, as it goes on to recount basically the entire history of the region until the present time of the author's writing. It's certainly a compelling story. A lesser Persian prince scorned by his family due to his partially commoner and foreign lineage decides, screw these dynastic politics, I'll make my own far cooler kingdom. And indeed, the Omani Arab recording does mostly line up with this account, just clarifying a few points here and there and embellishing a few details there. The biggest change comes from the Arabic version, fleshing out the idea of Monpana. In the Portuguese version, it states that Kilwa and its neighbors were under the control of Monpana, but it's not clear if this refers to a person or place. Meanwhile, the Arabic version doesn't refer to this term Monpana, but it does refer to a specific king. It describes him as the king of Al-Muli, not a guy named Al-Muli as the Wikipedia page falsely claims. A local kingdom that controlled the communities around Kilwa before Ali ibn Hassan had arrived. So, given how different it is, it's most likely that Montana is either a Portuguesified version of the name of the king of Al-Muli, or was the settlement that acted as the capital of Al-Muli. Anyways, while the Portuguese version just kind of moves on after Ali buys the island, the Arabic version gives a pretty different version of how things went down. In the Arabic version, shortly after selling the island, the king of Al-Muli decided that he wanted to renege on the deal. Meanwhile, in the Portuguese version, it's claimed that Kilwa was already an island, but in the Arabic version, Kilwa Kisiwani was not an island yet at all, but rather just an ephemeral island, connected by a sandbar that intermittently appeared or disappeared with the tides. Therefore, in the Arabic version, the quote-unquote fortification of Kilwa did not involve building defensive structures or walls as you would expect, but instead of simply dredging the sand away from the sandbar to remove it, turning Kilwa into a permanent island and literally separating it from the shore. Which version of this is true is hard to say. It's tempting to say that if there was a natural sandbar there, that the ocean's currents would have deposited sand back in the millennium since the story took place, but I don't really know enough about oceanography to say that with confidence. And to be honest, while the idea of a bunch of medieval people dredging up a sandbar to turn an ephemeral island into a permanent one might sound strange, it's actually not unprecedented, and similar things have been confirmed to happen in history. The exact population of the Kingdom of Al-Muli is something of a mystery as well. The most common guess is based on the fact that later in the Kilwa Chronicle, the people of Al-Muli are referred to as Muta Mandalin, which is sometimes assumed to be the Matumbi people, a non-Swahili culture but closely related to them that exists also in the region of Tanzania. But others, like Elias Saad, argue that Muta Mandalin is more likely a familiar name, a corruption of the Arabic tribal name Al-Mutamandir, since it was a fairly common practice in medieval East Africa for families to adopt the names of Arab tribes. In this case, Muta Mandalin might not refer to the people of Al-Muli collectively, but rather just one family within that kingdom. Of course, it's also possible, as some have suggested, that maybe Muta Mandalin and Al-Muli represent two different groups in the Chronicle, because it's not super clear whether or not they have any sort of relationship, but keep that name, Muta Mandalin, in mind, as it's going to be a pretty big deal later on. Now, as I alluded to earlier, this account of Kilwa's origin as founded by a prince from Persia is controversial to say the least. Indeed, it is true that European anthropologists often use the Persian founding legend to try and undermine the idea of the Swahili culture as an African civilization. They argued that due to the cosmopolitan nature of the East African coast, the undeniable achievements of that civilization were not truly African at all. As a result, much like I described earlier, it's instinctive for those of us interested in African history to push back against this narrative as a mere myth. Seeing people use it to justify this colonialist mindset makes us want to resist and say that it must not be true. And honestly, historians critical of the Kilwa Chronicles have some reasons to be skeptical. For starters, as we've explored in previous seasons, myths connecting African groups to Arab or Middle Eastern lineages are almost a ubiquitous trend throughout the continent. We saw it, for example, with the Ballad of Bayajida in our Sokoto miniseries, which claimed that Hausa culture was founded by an Arab traveler. And this is far from the only example. Indeed, this is not just limited to Africa either. Due to the prestige that ancestry from an Arab tribe carried throughout the medieval Islamic world, it was common for many powerful families in not just Africa, but Southeast Asia, Central Asia, Europe, and everywhere else where the Islamic faith was common, to claim descent from a distant, mysterious Arab or otherwise Semitic ancestor, often the child of an important Arab figure and an enslaved woman from the region, giving them a perfect mixture of that Arab prestige and that localness. Now, Ali in the Kilwa Chronicle was not an Arab, and was Persian instead. But could it not be possible that it's the same principle of a ruling family of local East Africans, creating a mythical origin for themselves with a prestigious Middle Eastern identity? There are also some other notable issues with this origin, such as the utter lack of Persian and other Iranian loanwords in Kiswahili. Kiswahili has plenty of Arabic loanwords, comprising almost a fifth of the language's total vocabulary. But the Persian linguistic influence on Kiswahili is so marginal to the point that it might not even exist at all, or just be a consequence of Persian loanwords in Arabic later transmitted to Kiswahili through those Arabic loanwords. Not to mention that Iran overwhelmingly practices Shia Islam, and there is very little evidence of a historic Shia presence in Tanzania. Lastly, and perhaps most significantly, there are no Persian records from this period recording the existence of a Sultan Hassan ruling over the city of Shiraz or the region of Fars in which it is located, nor of a prince named Ali ibn Hassan in that region. For decades, the historical profession therefore generally wrote off the account of the Kilwa Chronicles as just another example of these mysterious Middle Eastern ancestor origin myths that are all too common throughout Africa. However, and this is where it gets interesting, it turns out that when you take an even closer inspection, the case for the Kilwa Chronicle representing historical reality might not be as far-fetched as long believed. For starters, it's important to point out that Ali ibn Hassan was undisputedly a real guy and the oldest ruler of Kilwa that we know of. The debate here doesn't surround whether or not a guy by that name ruled in Kilwa, but rather whether or not he was a Persian immigrant. And next episode we'll discuss why we're so certain of his existence. But the problem here emerged from the fact that most people studying and inspecting the Kilwa Chronicle were people who specialized in the history of medieval East Africa, and oftentimes had a bit of a blind spot with medieval Iranian history. It turns out that a deeper inspection of the context of Iranian history at the time reveals that many of those earlier critiques I shared actually have a lot less weight to them than you might expect. Let's start with one of the most common criticisms, the lack of evidence for the practice of Shia Islam in Kilwa. It is true that Iran is overwhelmingly Shia today, but this was not necessarily true at the time of Kilwa's origin. In the 10th and 11th centuries, Iran was a predominantly Sunni region split up between multiple different kingdoms, albeit with an unusually large Shia minority and even still a notable Zoroastrian, Jewish, and Christian population as well. This isn't even to get into the reality that in the medieval Islamic world, the bipolar dichotomy between Sunni and Shia was in some ways less pronounced, more contested, and far, far more complex, but that's an entire different story. It's notable that the city of Shiraz, where the Persians in the story come from, was at the time ruled by a dynasty called the Buyids. While they were a Shia dynasty, the majority of the population was not, and even most of the region's local lords and nobility came from prominent Sunni families. Therefore, it's not only plausible but likely that a local prince fleeing from Shiraz would have been of a Sunni persuasion. The same might be true for the lack of Persian linguistic influence. Today, the Persian language is the main spoken tongue in Iran, especially in the area where Shiraz is located. I mean, the region with Shiraz, Fars, might actually even be where the term Persian comes from. However, like many other parts of the medieval Islamic world, even places where the vast majority of the population spoke a different language, Arabic was the main spoken language among the elites of the Buyid realm. This was especially true since the Buyid realm stretched outside of modern-day Iran, into regions where the majority of the population spoke Arabic natively. It's very plausible that a prince from 10th century Shiraz and his entourage from the courts would speak more Arabic in their daily lives than anything else. But oddly enough, the biggest piece of evidence in support of the Chronicle's account comes from genetic analysis. Now, I've talked before about how identifying ethnic ancestry through DNA analysis is actually a lot pricklier and much less precise than people think, especially when it comes to exact proportions of ancestry and exact locations and affiliations. That's right, if you took a test and have been telling everyone about your cool ancestry results, I don't want to rain on your parade, but those figures and that data is a lot less precise than you might think. But what is true is that through DNA analysis, you can detect certain genetic markers that tend to be associated with a particular region. And in 2023, when a team of anthropologists analyzed a collection of remains from various Swahili settlements in and near Kilwa in the medieval period, it does seem that starting in the late 10th and early 11th centuries, the people whose remains were analyzed often had an unusually high number of genetic markers associated with Persia and India, especially on the paternal side of family lineages. Meanwhile, the majority of the genetic markers as a whole, and almost the entirety of that on the maternal line, were those associated with East and Central Africa. While in most cases this gender disparity is used as evidence of violent conquest, the study in question argued otherwise. In addition to warfare, another area of life with a major gender imbalance was, of course, sailing. Given the later notoriety that the Swahili coast would possess in terms of maritime trade, the most likely reason for this gender disparity is that these genetics were introduced into the region by Indian and Persian merchants and sailors. Remember that in the last episode, while there wasn't much evidence of transoceanic trade, there was still some early Persian pottery present. Well, it's possible that this pottery was brought to the same sailors who started families in the area and left a genetic impact on the region. In short, the idea of the Kilwa Chronicle might represent a degree of historical reality is a little bit less far-fetched than was long assumed. While the lack of the appearance of a King Hassan ruling over Shiraz is maybe the biggest weakness in this case, it's, again, not a deal-breaker. In Persian sources from the time, it's not at all unusual for local vassal kings or the nobility of a specific region to be left out of records, and it's plausible that this absence doesn't need explaining at all. And in the case of Ali, the Chronicle makes it pretty clear that he left the region due to poor relations with his brothers. It would make sense for a figure like that to be expunged from any records if recorded. In summary, the story is more plausible than you might think, and the DNA studies indicate that there might be some truth to it. However, I mean that literally. Some truth does not necessarily mean that the document should be taken as wholly literal. These days, it seems like the historical community has settled on a sort of middle ground. Few historians still endorse the idea that Kilwa was started by a singular mass migration from Shiraz. Instead, it's more likely that this story was formed in later generations as a sort of cosmogonic myth, explaining the existence of Kilwa's unusual blended society. Prince Ali ibn Hassan, who again was with certainty a real historical figure, was used as a sort of one-man personification in the Chronicle of a more gradual, complex history of intermarriage between the local ancestors of the Waswahili and the numerous Persian, Indian, and other sailors who frequented the region's shores throughout the medieval period. In a metaphorical sense, the story might have arisen due to Swahili children asking, hey, why does great-granddaddy speak this different language, and this story being used as an origin. Most of these interactions likely occurred after Kilwa was already established as a regional power, and Ali ibn Hassan, as an early embodiment of this idea, just conveniently became a shorthand of explaining Kilwa's cosmopolitan ancestry. So what does this mean for how we assess Kilwa and Swahili civilization? Does this mean, as some historians long claim, that the Swahili were not truly African, and that their achievements are outside the scope of African history, that they were merely the descendants of foreigners and medieval colonizers? Well, I would argue far from it. While the genetic evidence indicates that, yes, Persian people did arrive in the area and made lives here, there is a very real lack of Persian cultural influence, which indicates that these Persian sailors very rapidly assimilated into Swahili society, rather than dominating them. Their descendants would speak Kiswahili. They would go on to write in a prose entirely different from that in Persia, and build cities and architectural styles unlike anything else on Earth. And this makes sense even within the context of the Chronicle, as it states that Ali ibn Hassan chose to settle on the Swahili coast due to its pre-existing reputation as a place where he could make a fortune, a place with pre-existing settled societies, both in the story and confirmed by archaeological evidence. We also know that while Ali ibn Hassan was a real historical figure, he most likely didn't truly found the city of Kilwa at all. We've already discussed the archaeological evidence that shows the existence of a small but settled and complex society on the island before his arrival, but even the chronicle itself confirms this as such. We can also assume that, while not the bastion of the Islamic religion that it would one day become, that Islam as a religion was already present in East Africa before Ali ibn Hassan's purported arrival. While the chronicle credits Ali with a lot, it never once makes the claim that he introduced an unfamiliar religion to the people. Indeed, it outright identifies several of the region's cities as Moorish or Muslim. The Arabic version of the chronicle, in its greater detail, emphasizes this idea further, stating that Ali ibn Hassan's party encountered a small community of Muslims already living on the island, who had even constructed a small mosque for their own worship. And yeah, that makes sense. Somalia, likely the first region to convert to Islam outside of Arabia, was located within very close proximity, and it would be very plausible, therefore, that merchants from the Middle East and Somalia, though fewer in number than they would later be, would have already introduced the religion to the area long before this purported Shirazi settlement. So with all that said, where do we come down on the subject of Kilwa's origin? Well, it seems apparent based on genetic and archaeological evidence that there was a noticeable influx of people, overwhelmingly male sailors, from Persia and to a lesser extent India, during the 10th and 11th centuries AD, around the time that the chronicle is supposed to take place. However, while there may be a grain of truth in the story, it's clear that this group of Persian arrivals thoroughly integrated into the likely already Islamicized culture and society of the Swahili, and left little cultural residue behind as a result. And so, while the idea of Kilwa being partially founded by a foreign group is plausible, the archaeological, textual, and cultural evidence shows firmly that the civilization that resulted was Swahili at its basis. However, even within the Kilwa Chronicle, no matter which version you read, the events following the foundation of the city will be far from smooth sailing. And the Kilwa Chronicle doesn't end there. Indeed, the story of the life of Ali ibn Hassan is only the beginning. Join us in our next episode as we explore how the chronicles describe Kilwa's rise from a small island city-state into a regional power. Thank you for listening to the History of Africa podcast. If you like our show, then we would greatly appreciate if you could help support the show and our project of freely available online history education. You can do this by supporting us at patreon.com/historyofafrica, providing us a rating or review on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, or iTunes, or by sharing the podcast with anyone who you think might enjoy learning about African history. This episode is brought to you by our supporters on Patreon, including Naomi Kanakia, Ayo Fagbamie, Dimitri, Alexander Travis, BB Milliam, Conrad Schwenke, Pascal Omokocha, Gio Maxwell, Nkechi Nwabodike, Kwajo Amankwa, Douglas Harder and Sherry Robinson, Craig Bolton, Samuel Badeau, Ghassan Firgiani, Kitty, Mac T, Kelvin Norris, Ellen Fisher, Jessica, Suison Blair, and Yannick Bolnet, among others. Thank you all for supporting the show. It really, 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 really means a lot.